everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the U School Podcast. I'm your one and only host, Scott Schimmel, and I'm here today with Jered Lish, and we're not together. Obviously, Jered, just spoiler alert, if you're watching this on video, you could tell we're in different rooms. But Jered, where in the world are you? Secondly, who the heck are you?
Great question. Thank you, Scott. Again, my name is Jered, and I'm one of the co-founders at iAlign.Work, and I'm actually based here in San Diego. So we are a strengths-based company that helps people kind of set goals for work and for life using a strengths philosophy. So I'm excited to talk to you more about strengths and whatever other questions you might have in store for us. So looking forward to it.
And you have some background with students, right?
I do, yeah. I was in higher education for around 10 years doing career counseling. So whether it's a first year freshman student being like, I don't know what I want to do with my life, to a pre-med student who's like, I have a very straight and narrow, very intentional career plan for my life. I would kind of help with all of that, and taught some courses on career development for around a decade. So yeah, I love the topic of people's futures. Futuristic is my number one strength. So I'm sure we'll talk about strengths today. So dreaming with people is kind of a passion of mine. So yeah, let me know what other context would be helpful.
What was it for you with strengths initially? I'm curious. For me, I was probably really interested in myself back when I was 21. I'm just curious for you, what was the origin story for strengths with you?
Yeah, totally. So for me, when the economy crashed in 2008, I was a communications major, and I think most parents are like, "What are you going to do with that?" And I was like, "Great question, mom and dad." So in 2008, couldn't find a job, but I really found a passion for education and also working with college students. I was an RA, an orientation leader. Did a lot of those collegiate things, and was like, "Wait, people can do this professionally." And so as a result of that, grad school kind of exposed me to the strengths-based theory, positive psychology. And from there, that's when I was like, oh, wow, this is a really good fit for me, in that I can help people dissect what their strengths are and then dream about a future that they want to pursue and help them kind of figure out a plan to making that happen. So that's a little bit of my exposure to strengths. So
you mentioned that freshman who has no idea what they want to do, and then contrast that with the pre-med student. And I work a lot with teenagers, and specifically with parents and educators who work with those teens. And both of those stories sound as familiar, as peanut butter and jelly, like every single day, either talking to a kid or a parent who's like, what do I do? They have no idea who they are or what to do. And the other one is, I hear a theme of concern sometimes from parents and teachers when they know a kid or have a kid in their family that is exceptionally explicitly clear about what they want to do. Because I think the wisdom of us older people would say, hey, you might have a plan, but likely that plan is going to change. So maybe start a little bit with the completely lost. I got no clue. I know I just want to go to the beach all day. What do you do? What's an approach that you take, and any advice you can give to an adult working with a kid like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's one of those things where for me, especially because we're talking about strengths, right? So when you think about like strengths, ultimately with like Clifton Strengths, what they try and help people do is identify your top 5 strengths of 34, which essentially are like patterns of thinking, right? And so for someone trying to figure out what they want to do with their life, the big question is, how do you think? Like when you're looking at the world, when you think about your values, what you bring to the table, what excites you about your future, a lot of it is kind of those thinking patterns, right? And so for me, that's where I would love like sitting down with someone and being like, hey, let's talk about your strengths. And they're like, well, I don't know, my strengths are. Then we have a starting point, right? And so for me, whether it was like someone figuring out for the first time, they're like, you know what, I'm a very, very relational human being. I have a lot of like empathy oriented strengths. Like I tend to know how people are feeling. Well, ultimately, sitting behind a desk where you can't use relational building strengths and you're just crunching numbers all day, that's never going to be a good fit for you, right? So, so I loved whether you were a student was exploring what they wanted to do with their life. Let's really help them unpack what's happening in their brain, like how are they processing things, and then taking some kind of steps towards a theory, right? Like I think I might like strategic planning, or I think I might like crafting something from nothing, so if they're in a place of exploration, strengths theory was great because you could be like, oh, this is how I like to think. For the pre-med student, because they're a little bit more on the type A, I have a very specific plan and set of goals I want to achieve. Even for them, I loved it because it was like, okay, if you are not relationally driven, but you're very driven by the science of things, very
Hmm.
like understanding really big complex problems that you're solving in your head. How can you still provide the best bedside manner
Mm.
possible, right? And so I think it's, again, bringing it back to the wiring of how we like to think and the strengths
Yeah.
that we bring to the table. I love kind of unpacking that with students to kind of
Yeah.
figure that out. And now full-time employees or organizations.
Right.
So for me, because of the strengths-based philosophy of Clifton Strengths and Gallup,
Yeah.
that was always a great starting point to kind of engage in dialogue around who am I, what are my talents, what are my
Yeah.
strengths, and then how do I apply that moving forward in my life is the theory that I kind of use with students.
What, this is probably such a dumb question, but I'm a parent, I'm a teacher. Tell me about the test, the strengths assessment. Like,
Yeah,
and I haven't done it in a while. I used to use this a lot with college students like you. Back in the day, it was a book you had to buy with the code
sure.
in the back of the book. How do you do it
Yeah.
now?
Yeah, I mean it's similar in the sense of it's still a code. So you go and you purchase the code. I believe it's 19.99 for the code,
Okay.
and then I forget the exact amount of questions they ask. It's a lot. It's around a 30-minute test, which
Okay.
means there's probably like 150 to 170 questions that of this or that, right? So
Yeah.
it's a rather long, extensive, like, would you prefer going to a
Mm.
party and being the life of the party, or would you
Right.
enjoy finding that person in the corner where you can go and have
Hmm.
a nice one-on-one authentic conversation?
Hmm.
And most people are like that one or that one.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of this or that kind of questioning. But
Huh.
what's beautiful about what psychologists can do is it really helps you kind of dissect. Yep, this
Yeah.
is how I prioritize my values. This is how I prioritize how I think. This is
Mm.
how I prioritize how I organize. Any of those things is what the assessment will hopefully kind of bring to light in your own life.
Yeah.
This is how you love processing the world, and because of that processing, it's technically a strength in your life, or in
Right.
theory it is, right? So and so there's no dumb questions. So hopefully that gives you some context to
What's
it's
the,
a lot of this or that
yeah.
questioning through Gallup.com.
Do you know the age minimum? I can't remember. Is it 13? Is it 15? 18?
For me, it is one of those. So I don't know the exact age that
Depends.
Gallup recommended. I want to say it was around like 15, 16. Is like,
Okay.
okay, like that you know enough about yourself where
Yeah.
when you go to answer those questions,
Yeah.
it makes sense. And I know, and I can follow up with you to see if they finished this, but I know that they were considering doing a strengths-based assessment for more on the kids side,
Oh,
but it
cool.
only identifies, I think, 20 strengths versus the full
Okay.
34. But I'll follow up with you on
Yeah.
that and see if
That's cool.
they finished that. Um, but yeah, I had an intern who he's only 15 right now, and I had
Uh-huh.
him take it. And
Nice.
what's interesting about, like, especially with you mentioning that you're a dad and you have kids, and
Hmm.
like how do my kids' lives, his top five, he shared three with his dad, and so
Mm.
it's kind of cool to like unpack for a
Interesting.
15-year-old, like, yeah, these are my strengths so far. And then I was like, oh, and I had his dad take it, and he's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, you actually share three of your top five. And he's like, I see how my dad influenced this way
Huh.
of thinking for me.
Yeah.
So it is kind of interesting, even for parents and kids, to kind of take it together and kind of help each other better understand how one another thinks. So I
Yeah.
love it, again, for that common place that you can kind of build from.
I know it's maybe a simpler, more simplistic way to look at a kid and try to help them would be to look at like their report card or their activities.
Mm-hmm.
You're athletic, are you in the arts, and try to build around those things. Like, oh, your grades or test scores in math are really high. Therefore, and I'm sure, well, if you're like me,
Mm-hmm.
if you looked in as I did it as a teenager through that lens, it sent me down a path that was actually really misaligned with some of the,
Yeah.
as you call it, like patterns of thinking. So I don't know. I just kind of want to like tee you up to speak to that a little bit. Like, how do
Yeah,
you make
sure.
sense of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, with that pattern of thinking where when it's repeated over and over and over again, that's why it becomes a strength, right? So
Hmm.
I mentioned earlier that futuristic is my number one strength. So
Yeah.
futurists love dreaming about the future, asking the question of what can be. And so anything where it's like, wow, the future is bright and the potential is endless.
Yeah.
How do I apply futuristic to being a mathematician, or how do I apply futuristic to being a doctor? Eventually you
Mm.
start to, at least for me, like I'll begin to break down, okay, well, I do want to dream about a future that I'm
Mm.
excited about. So then strength number two for me is maximizer. So I love the process of like good, better, great. And so if I'm
Yeah.
working with a person, for example, I'm going to love and I have individualization high, where I like to learn who is this person,
Uh-huh.
what's the diversity they bring to the table, and really listening to the story and finding those ahas of like, oh yeah, you're really brilliant with this. So with
Yeah.
my background in career counseling, right? Dream about somebody's future. Let's maximize on your potential,
Mm-hmm.
on your strengths. And I want to know who you are so we can leverage you into the future in a way that you'll achieve the things that you're dreaming about. So
Yeah.
I was like, how do I apply those strengths? Well, eventually I was in career counseling and I loved it. It was such a good fit. I was very
Yeah.
good at it. And now I'm dreaming about tech that helps align people to
Mm.
that. But I have strategic pie. So it's one of those things where like
Mm-hmm.
your strengths, if you get to practice them every day, you can apply that across lots of different career
Yeah.
options. And you'll probably love what you do, because if you can use that pattern of thinking all the time,
Yep.
you're probably going to be good at what you do, and you'll love what you do because you get to use your strengths every day.
Yeah.
Uh, People, surprisingly, when I share this with them, my last strength is empathy. So
Uh-huh.
people are like, oh, wow, Jered, like I'd never thought that you would be so low in empathy because you care a lot about people. And I was like, I do. I love people. I
Yeah.
love their feelings. I don't want to feel what they're feeling. Like if
Right.
they come to me and I don't want to feel their sadness, but I can
Yep.
be sympathetic, right? So, but for me
Mm.
at the same time, with that being my last strength, counseling eventually
Mm.
did wear me down, where it is a
Yeah.
very heavy in the feelings kind of thing. So it is one of those things where, at least when I've learned more about strengths and applied strength
Mm.
theory to my own life,
Yeah.
it's bringing it back to your point of like, well, I was good at math, or I was good at this as a kid, so therefore I should go do something with that. It's like, well, those are
Yep.
signs of a future that may be in alignment with your natural talents, but ultimately your strengths kind of are like, can I use these strengths in this job? So
Yeah.
I probably could talk your ear off for hours on all of the career counseling stories based on
Yeah.
talking strengths with people and then how they applied that theory to their life. And for a lot of people, yielding really great, meaningful, purposeful lives from that. Um, but it's a lot of scientific experiments, if you will,
Uh-huh.
with I'm going to try this, I'm going to dabble with
Yeah.
this. Did this feel like a good fit? And if the answer is yes, it's probably because your strengths were operating at a high functioning level, right? So anyways, I don't know if that answers your question. I
Yeah.
can be long-winded. Communication is number 6 for me, so I'll take a pause right now and
Yeah.
see what you think.
Well, back in the day, there were, and there still are, these tests that will, especially for young people, you answer these questions, and then we'll tell you career fields that you should be in. And
Mm-hmm.
strengths, I think, as you're listening, strengths finder and strengths assessment is different than that, and it requires some work. I remember taking it maybe 2021 at the end of college. I didn't really know what to do with it. A bunch of these words, labels that it gave me. And then
Mm-hmm.
I had to take it 3 or 4 years later for a grad program and actually sit down with a strengths coach like you. And that's
Sure.
when it all came alive. First, I think hunch for me was, wait a second, they're the exact same answers and strengths that I took for 3 or 4 years ago. I would have guessed that they'd be different. And those
Mm-hmm.
patterns were actually more entrenched in me. But what I've learned as I sat with the coach and really unpacked this stuff, and you're given a great, I think, demonstration, illustration, what the work is like. It's more like detective work than it
Mm-hmm.
is quick fixes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking for, hey, if a kid is trying to apply to a college right now, pick a major, this is probably not the short solution for you. But if you do
Mm-hmm.
have a kid that's 13, 14, 15, number one, for you to take this as a parent or a teacher and start processing this for your life, because the
Mm-hmm.
vocabulary, as you're sharing these words, they become
Mm-hmm.
a second language to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I'm saying is, the more you put into this, the more patterns you'll see clearly, and the more you'll be able to
Mm-hmm.
help other folks.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any, as we wrap up, are there any resources that you'd point to for a parent or someone working with a young person, like what they could do, or any advice for them?
Yeah, sure. So, once you do take the assessment, Gallup has done such a great job in generating a ton of reports. So right now at
Huh.
this point, you can go and unlock a bunch of different types of reports to learn more about your top strengths. So for
Cool.
example, the $20 rates gets you the introduction to your top 5, which you can unpack so much just knowing your top 5.
Yeah.
And then you can unlock the full 34, which I mentioned my last strength. So if number 1's futuristic, number 34 is empathy. But
Okay.
that report is rather robust, and
Huh.
it's very it can coach you into a lot of different directions of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, you can do what's my management style, what's my
Yep.
sales style. Like they have a
Huh.
ton of different reports now,
Cool.
so that you can just go and once you've taken the assessment, you just go and unlock it, if you will.
Gotcha.
So that's great. But then Gallup has done a great job of pulling all of their curriculum into like I really want to unpack, how do I think? And so they have full curriculum now. On as soon as you log in, you can kind of do like your own self-guided tour to learn your strengths. But I do think that the big takeaway, and I think you brought it up with your own story, is when you get the report, you're like, okay, cool, like this makes a lot of sense. But it is the coaching component that really kind of does make it come alive for a lot of people, because until you can really like call out what is the strength and then really talk through how does this actually play out in my life, and then all the patterns do start to kind of, you're like, oh, that makes sense in my relationship with my significant other. Oh, that makes sense in my parenting style with my kids. Like whatever it might be. I do think that the coaching and the unpacking of, especially sequencing. So like if your number one strength is this and your third strength is this, how do those two things show up, or these three? So I do think that is kind of the power of coaching, and better understanding that. So, but yeah, there's so many books that I could recommend. I don't know how you kind of communicate resources out, but I'll share.
We'll put them in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect. I'll share some of my favorite resources that I use when I'm coaching people. But
awesome.
Trying to think of anything else goes to mind, but I think that's where I'll kind of pause.
If people want to get connected with you, how would they do it?
Yeah. So www.iAlign.Work is the company that we're launching for strengths-based coaching, and helping people kind of explore the things that we talked about today. Like what's the future you're dreaming about, and how can you set some really tangible goals to make that future a reality? So iAlign.Work is where we operate. And so, contact us. All the emails come directly to me. So
great.
So if you want to start there, that's perfect.
Awesome. Jered, thank you. Really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch.
All right. That sounds great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Scott.
Hey, thanks for joining in on the U-School podcast. We'd love to share with you the resources available on our website at theuschool.com. Not just articles, ebooks, worksheets, and other podcast episodes, but specifically, you should know about a free course we have available called the Real Me course. It's digital, it's interactive, and it'll guide you to get clearer about who you are and the great story you could tell with your life. So go register for a free account and get started on the Real Me course today at theuschool.com. That's theuschool.com.